Hello! So I have an aim to read 1,000 books on YouTube with you guys, and I have now finished another 5 books to add on to that 1,000 books. And those books are these ones. The first book out of those, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, it's 5, right? Yeah, 5 books. The first one is Warren Buffett's The Interpretation of Financial Statements. The idea behind this book is to identify a company that has a durable, long-term competitive advantage through reading the financial statements of the company. This is how, in theory, Warren Buffett made most of his money, and it's in theory how you're going to make most of your money. What I like about the book is that it's actually very easy to read. It doesn't incorporate too much technical stuff where it's not needed. It keeps it very simple, and it keeps it to core ideas that will actually help you identify competitive advantages, rather than going into like the min-maxing and putting things into a large equation and be like, oh, okay, if this thing fits this, now that thing fits this, this company definitely has a competitive advantage, so on and so forth. It doesn't do that. It just keeps it to the simple ratios, simple finance, and the ideas in here are actually quite good. For example, one chapter goes over revenue and cost of goods sold, basically how many products do you have to sell to actually gain revenue. And he says, for example, that a lot of companies will have consistently good, companies that have durable, long-term durable competitive advantages will have consistently good profit margins. In fact, as their market cap increases, you should expect that their profit margins should either remain the same or even become better over time. So the cost of goods sold, you will see, for example, either goes down or remains the same as the company grows. On top of that, they'll have a really good margin for cost of goods sold. That maybe they're only for the revenue that they get, maybe they will only sell, or maybe they will only chew up 60% of their revenue or 55% of their revenue. Sometimes 70, but usually 60 to 55. And over the years, what you'll see is that their cost of goods sold will either remain the same or go down because they have a competitive advantage, meaning that they're not in a hyper-competitive industry. Companies that have profit margins that shrink over time or don't consistently grow probably have to basically trade off profit for market share if they want to grow, and that is likely the result of them being in a competitive industry where in order to even gain market share, you're going to have to basically sell some profit away, drop your price, or spend more and more money to outcompete competitors. So that's one chapter that I really liked to listen. It was very simple, it's very straightforward analysis that everybody can understand. Something else that was interesting in this book was Buffett doesn't like to touch companies that have more short-term debt than they do have long-term debt, and he doesn't like to touch companies that have a lot of long-term debt that they aren't paying off within 2 to 4 years. So the reason why he doesn't like companies that have more short-term debt than long-term debt is because short-term debt is subject to more shifts in credit markets. And the idea here is that people can take on long-term debt and basically sell it as short-term debt, and hopefully if the short-term debt remains cheap, you can make profit like that, right? But if the short-term debt becomes expensive, he says companies that have short-term debt basically will have a risk to their operations. So if their operating expenses are being financed by short-term debt, and there's a shift in the credit market where short-term debt becomes expensive, now there's a risk to the company's operating expenses. And he says especially what he doesn't like is when companies basically go through economic turmoil and their finances are so not robust, they're the opposite of robust. They're so flimsy, like heavily dependent on short-term debt, that during economic hardship, all the gains from the last 5 years, as a shareholder, just disappear. They're completely gone. All the earnings, it's just gone overnight. He does not touch companies that don't have a consistently growing earnings per share year over year, in part because it's a way to measure that the company isn't subject to flimsy economics. That's one of the reasons why he won't touch companies with too much short-term debt, or short-term debt that is higher than their long-term debt. In addition to that, companies that have too much long-term debt, if they are not paid off in 2 to 4 years, he takes this as evidence that their earning power is really bad. And if their earning power is really bad, that means they don't have a competitive advantage. For example, if you look at the marketing expenses Coca-Cola has compared to other soft drink companies like Pepsi, but Pepsi's also pretty good, what you'll find is that they don't have to spend a lot on marketing, which means their earning power can actually be quite high, which is why you see that they in fact pay off most of their long-term debt in 2 to 4 years, even though the debt might be set up for 5 to 10 years. So he won't touch companies with too much long-term debt that's not paid off quick enough, and more short-term debt than long-term debt is also a risk. He also likes companies that have a lot of long-term investments, and on the one hand, because of accounting reasons, companies can't write off long-term investments higher than their book value, which means they can have hidden treasure, so to speak. There could be investments that have accrued in value, but they have to keep it to their book value. But on top of that, it's a way of measuring the thinking of upper management. If there's a lot of money in long-term investments, then they're looking into the longevity of the company, the future of the company, the quote-unquote delayed gratification. They're not like liquidating money out of the company. They're putting it back into the company to make it more productive going into the future. He really, really likes companies that have a lot of long-term investments. Another key thing that he looks for is consistent or consistently decreasing sales and general administration. Sales and SGA. I think it's sales and general administration. He basically doesn't want this to be super high, because if it is super high, like for example, if your business is completely dependent on high sales, then what could happen is as soon as the economy tanks, your business can tank. And he doesn't like that. That's not a way to consistently make returns over time. He considers it flimsy economics. If your business is dependent on paying for really, really expensive employees, then again, the second your company doesn't have money, you're not going to be able to afford those employees, and then your company will tank. He doesn't like the idea of companies that are dependent entirely on sales and general administration. So he also has some chapters where you will look over what are good ratios for sales and general administration. Overall, this is why I like this book. It is simple, clearly written. The financial ratios in here are just basic arithmetic. There's nothing complex in this. And on top of that, it doesn't trade off sophistication or like efficiency or efficacy or competency. It doesn't trade off competency for simplicity. In fact, its simplicity is an aid to its competency. So that's why I really like this book. I highly recommend people read this book. It is a great book. The next book is The Everything Store, Jeff Bezos and the Age of Amazon. So this book was an attempt to communicate the history of the company. It's a biography of the company, but what it really is in practice is a biography of Bezos and the company. And that has some pros if you're looking for that, but I wasn't looking for that. I was looking for a book that was going to go into the economics of Amazon, the strategies of Amazon, and talk about this stuff. It does do that, but not as much as I would like. It does spend a lot of time talking about Jeff Bezos and his childhood, his personal life, things like that. And I heard that the follow-up to this book, which is also, but it's Brad Stone, he wrote another book. That book also, I heard, is even worse for this, where it just deals with all the scandals involving Jeff Bezos, and it doesn't deal too much with the actual business itself. So I wish it would have focused more on the business, and if you're going to read that book, keep in mind it's not completely focused on the business. So let's talk about the actual book now. So to the extent that it did talk about Bezos, I did like some of the things that it mentioned. For example, it talks about his early education and how he went to a school that really encouraged him to read and write and critically think. It was a quote-unquote gifted child school, I think. I believe that's what it was. I liked seeing this. This was very interesting. On top of that, it also shared Bezos' background with his biological father. I thought this was a really interesting story where when Bezos was in his late 30s, I think, and he had recently just become the richest man in the world, although I don't think he is anymore, he received a letter from his biological father, and he found out who his biological father was, and his biological father didn't even know that Bezos was the richest man in the world at this point. Basically, his biological father left him very early on in life, and then later in his 30s, found out that he was running Amazon. And so he found out that the son that he had was the richest man in the world. I thought that was really, like, it's almost like a fiction. It's very strange that would happen. Very not normal. So I thought that was interesting. I also liked hearing about Bezos reading books and what books he read. I actually bought some of the books that he was reading. That being said, some of the books he does read I feel like are really trash. I didn't like all of them that he read, but I did buy some of them. And the way he would try to implement these things inside the company, like for example, he read a book on evolution, and after reading a book on evolution, he used this to start Amazon Web Services, and he also tried to basically have each department inside Amazon produce a function, a function that would measure their fitness, and he did it to even like the legal department. People said that this wasn't going to work, and it didn't work. It failed, so he gave up on it. But just hearing about the stuff behind the scenes is kind of interesting. It's a very quirky way of running the business, and I like hearing about stuff like that. And on top of that, when the book did to talk about the actual business itself, it was quite interesting. For example, he did cover that Amazon is racing towards city centers, that they want more fulfillment centers closer to cities as a way to shrink the amount of time required to ship the product to your house. For example, when they bought out I don't know if it was Whole Foods or Superfoods, some grocery store, they bought it out, and I think they were going to use this as a way to ship products to you, so it was going to have dual purpose. It was both a grocery store but also a shipping warehouse. So that stuff was interesting to read about. So I'd say in general this book is a bit too much focused on Bezos himself, not enough focused on the economics of the company or like the business strategy of the company. And I was looking for the business strategy type book. I think I have some other books on Amazon that will maybe fulfill that. Just a heads up, if this is a very popular book, I think it's actually overrated, but if you're looking for a book on Amazon that also covers Bezos, then this is the one for you. If not, this is not the one for you. This next book is The Masterson's Approach to Therapy, Psychotherapy of the Disorders of the Self. So actually, it is for personality disorders in specific. And when it says Masterson's approach, it is actually this guy, I think his name is James Masterson. Yeah, James F. Masterson. He has a specific approach to therapy that he goes through in this book with some other people that he has taught. Now, what I liked about the book, let's go with what I liked about the book, okay? The ideas in the book are actually quite cool. This Masterson's approach that I don't thoroughly understand, I approximately understand it, has this idea that there is a true self, like your real self, and then there is an authentic self. And as a therapist, you have to basically identify what is the true self and what is the fake self. And the fake self has a lot of interesting effects. So for example, it distorts perception, or it guides perception to be more towards your fake self rather than your authentic self. For instance, let's say you have someone who has borderline personality disorder. When they perceive you as setting boundaries and wanting to distance yourself, so for example, it was common for when a therapist wanted to take vacation after working for 6 months, the inauthentic self, or the borderline self, would view this as abandonment. And so it was distorted perception to view it as abandonment, when in reality it wasn't abandonment. So it had this distorting effect on perception. And this distortion effect can be applied to both objects, relationships, and people. And what the Masterson's approach does, because they're really good at dealing with borderline, is they do things like confrontational therapy, or they will deliberately engage with the false self, the facade they call it, and either if they engage with the confrontational therapy, then they will challenge beliefs that the facade has. So if, for example, the person with borderline said, "Oh, you're abandoning me," well, they would say, "No, I'm just going on vacation because I'm really tired," and so on and so forth. They would directly confront it. They called it confrontational therapy. Whereas another type of approach that they had was, if it was like, say, narcissistic personality disorder, then they would be more willing to engage the facade and work within the internal worldview of the facade. And I think those are kind of interesting ideas, which are common, this idea that you can engage with people's false selves to help them destroy that false self, or the idea that you can confront them. Another thing that was interesting that you might have saw in my YouTube shorts was this idea of acting out. So he said, well, they said, it was very common when you confront personality disorders or facades that they will engage in ego defense. And the ego defense can often look like acting out behaviors, where they'll be emotionally volatile, maybe scream at you, yell at you, attack you. He said it was very common, or again, they said it was very common for when a narcissist came in and you challenged them on their narcissistic grandiosity, right? Because narcissists want this mirroring act where you represent their false sense of self in the way that you behave. So for instance, if a narcissist comes in and acts like they're the world's greatest painter, if you make any inclinations or suggestions towards the idea that they aren't the world's greatest painter, then you're not mirroring that fake self. And as a result, they will attack you and maybe call you stupid or dumb. And they would say this is ego defense. And the way that they're doing it is an acting out. They're acting out the ego defense. It's like a maladaptive way of behaving. And you can't get wrapped up in that ego defense. You have to recognize it for what it is and work with that. I thought that was also very interesting. And they also have different classifications of like a high-level borderline patient versus a low-level borderline patient. And they also have, what was really cool was a realistic understanding of therapy, where the therapist is a human that can't solve all the problems, in the sense that they had parts in here where they were reflecting on how they failed their patients in many ways, because either one, they got too wrapped up in the patient's emotions, right? They were reacting too much to people's facades. They let too much of their own personal issues leak into the therapy, or maybe they took the wrong strategy given the presentation of the current patient. I thought that was also really cool. One of the drawbacks of this book was some of the writers suck at writing. I don't know what it is with psychologists and having to write in pretentious ways. It's not just psychologists, but psychology tends to abuse it the most. Not the most. They're bad for it. So are medical students. And I'm not just making this up. I actually read a book that went over corpus linguistics data, like a statistical analysis of writing styles by journals. And they looked at, for example, the abuse of abstract terms by subject. And psychology was one of the, like neuropsychology in specific, but psychologists in general, just talking like overly abstract jargon that is not conducive to clear and coherent communication. You don't have to write in jargon to communicate to people. It's a side rant. Some of the writers in here, unfortunately, abuse abstract terms to talk about what are otherwise ordinary things. And it's not, I would say it's only one of the writers, and they only have 4 chapters in this book, I believe. So, I don't know. On top of that, the book is not an empirical book in the sense of like it's going to provide hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of data points about people in over thousands of people in a population. Not hundreds of data points. A few data points that based off of 1,000 or so people. It doesn't do that. It is a therapy book where they're going to talk about the interviews that they had with specific people. So you could say, I would say it's heavy and qualitative. There is some quantitative data that is cited in here, but it's like secondary to like support their arguments or their interpretations or how they view the interview process. So it's a qualitatively heavy book in that sense. Other than that, I don't have too many complaints. I mean, I knew what I was getting into when I was reading a psychotherapy book from, what is it, the 80s? I'm not reading this to 1989. I'm not reading this to get like the most modern statistics. I'm simply reading this to understand the therapeutic process better, right? I was just getting a model for therapy and how to understand people, and I think this stuff is fun. So I would say if you want to read about therapy, this is not a bad book. It's one of the better books I've read, but you have to keep in mind about which kind of book you're reading. Don't go into this thinking you're going to get the most scientific, up-to-date worldview. It is going to simply be a specific style or a specific approach to therapy. Now the last 2 books I read I actually reviewed together, so I won't speak too much on these. It is the Benjamin Franklin, Walter Isaacson biography and the Benjamin Franklin autobiography. apparently people don't care about Benjamin Franklin because not a lot of people seem to actually care about whenever I talk about these books. I'm being hyperbolic. The books are good. Both of them are good. Obviously, Benjamin Franklin's autobiography praises him a little bit too much because he wrote it. He tends to cover all the good stuff about his life. Doesn't mention, for example, that he kept writing to his wife for like 5+ years saying, I'll return, even when she was like super sick, really, really sick, to the point of going to die. He kept saying, oh, I'll come back. And meanwhile, he wasn't. He was in London, living a very, I don't know if it was London or if it was Paris, living a very cosmopolitan life, drinking with nobles or gentlemen and scholars. And then she died, and he just still didn't return. And then the biography, where you'll get more of these realistic representations of Benjamin Franklin, I think is a bit better than the autobiography. Both of them are good. I would say if you want to read about Benjamin Franklin, read his autobiography. It's worth it. It's short. It's not that long. It'll take you maybe 3 days, 4 days if you're consistently reading. And then definitely follow it up with a biography. Isaacson wasn't too favorable nor too pessimistic or like too unfavorable towards Franklin. He does point out like strengths of Franklin, especially as they got older. Franklin became better at being a politician. And in his early days, he was absolutely a shrewd businessman and a scientist and an inventor. His contributions to science are very important. So he gets both of these negatives and pros about Benjamin Franklin correct. And Ben Franklin, and he writes well, and it's interesting to see how he uses his own life. So those are the last 5 books that I read. I don't know, what is that, like 40 out of 1,000? No, that's too high. Gotta be like 29 or 30 out of 1,000. I don't know. If I had to say you definitely should read any of these books, it would be the Financial Statements book, The Interpretation of Financial Statements. That's super helpful, super useful. And The Psychotherapy of the Disorders of the Self. I think those are my 2 favorite books out of the 5. And then Benjamin Franklin, and then The Everything Story. The Everything Story actually it's not that good. I would say it's like a 3 out of 5, if I'm being generous. With that being said, guys, let me know if you want me to read anything, and bye-bye.